Open Channel, the program Ecologic. We here for the month of May, a beautiful time of the year. I guess the tomatoes are coming in, cucumbers are coming in, the blackberries are still getting ripe, so it's a beautiful time of year, making blackberry fine. We have with us tonight Mark Miller, who's been in the oil business for many years in the Lafayette area and involved in oil with the Independent Petroleum Association. That's a national organization that Mark's on the board and was a past president. So, Mark, share with us your history with oil in Acadiana and how you got here and what's your involvement today.
Thank you, Harold. I began my oil career for a great local company called John C. Chance and Associates, working offshore as an instrument man, and I was trying to get in the oil business and trying to get a job led me to offshore. I worked offshore for Mr. Chance and Mr. Stutes for about 6 months and got to know them, and they treated everybody just like a family. And I really learned a lot about offshore during those times. The amount of hard work that goes in, the technology, some of the danger involved. I got to witness some things that were a little iffy out there. And so I worked there for a while, and then I had an opportunity to become a petroleum landman through my dear friend Sean Bradley. And I took that opportunity and began buying leases, much like Harold's son does, Todd. And it's been a good career to me. So here I am 30-something years later, and I'm still doing that and have some interest in producing oil wells and have made it my career, and glad to say it's been good to me and my family.
And of course, in all that time, you have witnessed the cycles that oil is inevitably a part of. And, you can call it oil, you can call it sugar, you can call it wheat, corn, cattle. All these are world commodities that go through the business cycles. If there's too much sugar in the world, the price is going to fall off. If there's not enough, the price of sugar will go up the roof. And the oil is part of that. It's a national commodity. And those who have been in it for the long run have seen these ups and downs and knows that the downs are going to go up. And of course, starting to see, I think we passed the bottom, so to speak. We still certainly have trying times ahead, but the demand for petroleum products is not going to go away by any means. As the world economy improves, as we get, automobiles to more and more people around the world, the need for tires, the need for, fuel based on oil, but it's not going to be electric cars. Electric cars going to be part of the future, but not a major part of the future. So anyway, share with us what your thoughts are, first of all, for Louisiana, and then where we are in the nation, and then how's that going to fit in the global scheme?
Okay. One thing that's so obvious to me, but not to everybody who's not in the oil and gas business, Louisiana is so well suited for this business. We have smart people that are willing to come up with creative ideas to build tools for the oil and gas industry and export those tools and the technology all around the world. The more technology we blend into the oil and gas business, the more efficient it becomes, and the less of a footprint it puts down on different pieces of property. For example, 3D seismic shoots today are so superior to what seismic shooting was back in the 50s and 60s. We can tell with a great degree of accuracy where the oil and gas is and drill for it safely, responsibly, and environmentally friendly, more so than ever before. So technology is driving our business, and being able to put it to work in Louisiana would be a good thing. We've suffered here in particular because of a myriad of different things. We've had lawsuits, we've had price environments since November that we were making too much oil and gas as a nation, and the price of oil began going down. And then the Russians and the Saudis got into a situation where they were putting pressure on us, and our shale producers in particular have been suffering because $55 oil is not there. It's somewhere around $32 today. And at that price, it's hard to go and explore for shale in the current environment. But Louisiana, I would like to say, Harold, is we have the infrastructure, we have the engineering know-how, we have the people. We are so set up to produce oil and gas responsibly and continue to feed our families and run our economy, both local, city, and state. And I just believe we can do it in a responsible fashion. And we need to continue to push forward to do that, to run the economy in our state, in our backyard.
You know, we're seeing a major change in electrical generation that, you know, if you go back 5 years, about 50% of electrical generation was coal. About 25% was natural gas in one way or another. And then you had a very small percentage of renewable, 1 or 2%, and then nuclear energy was over 20% nationally. We've seen a dramatic shift. Natural gas-fired generation now has become almost the cheapest power. The cheapest power we have is wind. Next to it is combined natural gas, which they're very close to each other. And coal is way out in cost, and now coal is less than 20% of the nation's generation capacity. And natural gas has taken the place, and mainly because of the efficiency of natural gas and its ability to back up wind and solar projects. The natural gas turbines of today are over 60% efficient.
Sure.
They're combined cycle units, and they're smaller. They can turn on and off in a few minutes, and so when the wind quits blowing, they can instantly turn these things on. As opposed to a coal plant, you can't turn them on and off. They run for months and months at a time. And to turn one off, it's like the old steam train. It would take about 30 hours to restart one at full energy output. So, and you can't slow them down. A coal-fired plant runs at 100%. It will not run at 95%. And so you have to run it full blast all the time. And these smaller combined, very efficient combined cycle gas units, they turn off at night when the need is not there, and when the need cranks up in the morning, they crank up. And there's a big change happening, and the natural gas availability is leading that. You're on the air? Can we help you?
Yeah, this is Jim Schamberger. I got a question for Mark. Just curious, with the growing orphan wells, you know, what the state is currently having inventory, and with all the bankruptcies that look like are coming down the pike, where more of this orphan well inventory will be growing, what are your thoughts about the industry stepping in to do something here? Or do you have maybe information on what's kind of going on in the background to address these issues, whether it's federal help? The state's not going to be able to do it. It's going to bankrupt the state of Louisiana with the orphan well program. I'm just curious, any ideas what you think the solutions will be to this problem? And I'll get off the phone and let y'all discuss it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
I actually had a call from a gentleman last week from Little Rock who was down in Louisiana. He was driving down, particularly looking for orphan wells, trying to take them and figure out a way to make money with them. He calls himself an oil farmer, oddly enough. What that means is he'll take the existing orphan well, and if it's capable of producing a barrel or two a day, he would go to the state and say, let me produce this well and make some money for it, and then begin putting aside some money to actually plug and abandon the well. It sounds like a good idea. I helped him as much as I could. I told him about some wells that I was familiar with. The problem with that is that, as you might imagine, that he might garner $20,000 in revenue, and it might take $100,000 to actually plug the well. So it's not always going to be economically viable. But some orphan wells out there, do provide an opportunity to go back in some oil fields and make some money with them. And as far as who's going to pay for it at the end of the day, I know there's some very talented people that serve on the Orphan Well Board in the state, and I am not one of those people, but I know they talk about that often. And it is a concern. We need to address it going forward. And I'm pretty sure the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association has a plan to help both our legislators and our tax people to figure out at DNR how to deal with those orphan wells over time. I can tell you this, though. I have one particular client who operates some wells in Acadia Parish, and he's a client partner, and he's got some deep wells where he's going to take some of the pipe from orphaned wells and he's going to plug and abandon them. And then he's going to take that pipe and possibly use it for the drilling of shallower wells. So there are ways to do it, and people in the pipe business can tell you a lot more about it. It sounds a lot easier than it probably actually is. But there again, I believe that we have a lot of ingenuity, and you put ingenuity and opportunity together with some Cajuns, and they're going to come up with some ways to make some of those orphan wells make some money.
It's interesting, we talk about Louisiana. Is this an issue in Texas or Wyoming or Colorado?
It is. The numbers of the orphan wells in Texas are actually very high. But I think most of those wells are relatively shallow. I came across a situation recently where some wells were actually drilled in Texas and abandoned, and people had forgotten they were there until we were out looking at something else. But they're relatively shallow, so the cost is not nearly so much. The deeper wells in the orphan well program are certainly the ones that are much more expensive and more difficult to plug.
And then you start talking about those in the coastal zone,
Right.
or in the bays in the Gulf.
Right.
They're a lot more expensive.
Absolutely.
You can triple the cost, I guess, to go from land to an offshore environment.
And I will mention this too. Scott Angel, who's right here from Acadiana, he has also addressed the wells in federal waters, shallow federal waters, to try to come up with a plan to see what can be done with those wells and move forward on getting the old wells plugged as they are now. Many more wells are being plugged than drilled, and he's trying to find a way to help initiate some economic upswing on our shallow federal water properties, and we appreciate that, Scott.
One of the things I ran into, the manager of the Côte Blanche field, his company, that field was producing about 6,000 barrels a day, and they had a set aside to deal with abandoned wells, no longer functioning wells. And they had 30 wells that they were going to take out. They ran into a real problem with the state of Louisiana, especially wildlife and fisheries. That's on two issues. One was they wanted to charge them $1 million per well for oyster damage, which is kind of nonsense where these wells are. They hadn't been a live oyster there probably in 500 years. It's not a live oyster area. It's on the north shore of Côte Blanche Bay, where you got cypress trees growing in the water. So it's not an oyster environment at all. And then the next, they wanted a piling with a continuous light. And the operator of that field says that piling and that light, between maintaining it and the insurance on it, it's going to cost me $1,000 a month. And I got 30 of these. That's $30,000 a month. And he says, I'm going to let these become orphan wells.
Yeah.
And they had the resource, the P&A, but the state just put these as, how ridiculous to collect oyster damage by wildlife and fisheries. So, now the state's going to end up, as it turned out, they can end up with those 30 wells as orphan.
Which is a shame. There needs to be a balance. And I will say this, I think we all recognize that in the past couple of years, the state of Louisiana has had to cut back, and a lot of people lost jobs and areas that we would call upon and go to their expertise, so that we're doing more with less at the state. I understand that, but in that situation, that was a bad trade, I think.
A real bad trade,
Yeah.
yes. There's oil companies, and the reason they wanted a piling was because one of these coastal restoration projects on the east end of Marsh Island hit one of these wells. Now, they're dredging 30 or 40 feet down, and the well is P&A'd at 16 below the mud line.
Right,
So they hit one, and this thing blew out.
right.
And it eventually, I guess, standed over because nobody did a thing about it. It blew for about 2 months, and it didn't catch fire, but it was blowing up about 200 or 300 feet. Not humongous. I mean, but it was very obvious. And if you got close to it, it's quite noisy, you know. But it eventually healed over. But from that experience, I think they wanted to properly identify to a potential coastal restoration dredging up mud to make marsh, that they stay away from these abandoned wells. Because they're vulnerable, because they're dredging more than 16 feet below mud line.
Right. Well, to Mr. Schamberg's question, back to that a second. I do know of situations where responsible companies like Devon Energy, there's still abandoned wells that go back 2 or 3 or 4 generations of companies before them. That Union Gas had this well, eventually Pennzoil, now Devon. Devon will step up and do the right thing and plug those wells where they can, and they are not afraid. They're not going to shy away from that. I don't know any oil operator in my career, my lifetime, that's running from these orphan wells. If it's their responsibility, they want to step up and do the right thing. They don't want to hurt the environment. And Harold, if I may, one of the other biggest misconceptions I hear about in our business is, you guys are just reckless. You're going to go out there and produce oil, and if you spill oil, you're just going to walk away from it. Well, if you're going to the grocery store and you have $3 in your hand to buy a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk, you don't want to just drop $1 and walk on by. I don't want to spill a drop of oil because it costs money. Every drop of oil that gets spilled accidentally
It's not going to the refinery and you're losing money.
That's right. Why would I
Yeah,
throw those dollars
why
away?
would you waste it, right?
It's a huge misunderstanding. It really
Yeah,
is.
right,
So,
yeah.
the other thing I'd like to say, if we're waiting on some more calls, is I believe, and I know some oil men here in town, such as Tommy McCaslin. He drives a Tesla. He's got an oil company. He drives a Tesla. We're not opposed to integrating electric cars, solar, wind into what we do. We just want to keep the oil business going to supply the basic needs, which you alluded to earlier. We're not going to outgrow that anytime soon. And
Somebody's got to realize that in your electric car, you're going to have rubber tires that are made strictly from natural gas. Carbon black is the raw material, strictly derived from natural gas. The fertilizer that gives us humongous production of corn and soybeans and rice and you name it, that's all oil and gas products. And the tractors that harvest it, a 12-row corn combine takes over 400 gallons a day to run. And it's magnificent that we have this equipment that can harvest and produce crops that literally feeds the world.
Right.
You go back 10 years, and average production on corn was about 110 bushels an acre. Last year it was 174. Probably in a couple of years, it's going to be over 200 bushels per acre. And that's phenomenal.
Sure.
That this increased production. 80% of our agricultural products is shipped around the world to feed a starving world. And it's shipped on barges and ships, and all of it need, petroleum products to run. And
Absolutely.
the electrical generation industry is quickly shifting to renewable, and that's a real plus. That's not a conflict, I don't think, at all. And some of the biggest oil guys in the country are part of that. Warren Buffett is involved in a 7,000 acres, 690 megawatt solar farm in Las Vegas. 7,000 acres.
Huge.
And then Philip Anschutz in North Wyoming, I think he's the 40th richest guy in the world, oil man. And he's putting 1,003 megawatt turbines, 3,000 megawatts of power. And included in this power operation in northern Wyoming is the grid system to deliver that power to Las Vegas, 800 miles away. Now, this is an oil guy. He made his billions in the oil business.
But he's smart enough to know.
Smarter enough to know that he's not just in oil business, he's in the energy business.
Bingo.
And you know, I think BP is aware of that. Certainly Shell is becoming aware of that. I don't know where Exxon is on that, but you know, if the oil company is going to have a future, they have to be a part of the renewable component of it. And you know, I mean, an amazing thing like cattle, you know, methane produced from manure from hogs and cattle and whatever can be produced in 4 hours. And that methane is the same, it can go right through a gas turbine like natural gas.
Right.
And it's a renewable component. So you're putting in combined cycle gas turbines, not only it can run on the gas from landfills, it can run on natural gas, it can run on a mix, it can run on methane produced from, you know, cow manure and so forth. There's a company here in Lafayette that built a 20 megawatt cow manure generating system in Arizona. And they've had problems with it. One of the big problems is getting, you know, the cow manure into the process without a lot of dirt. And, you know, that's given them a real hassle, that if the manure is contaminated with, you know, but I think they're gradually getting it resolved. But it takes 20,000 cows to produce electricity for 20,000 people. It's kind of an interesting relationship. Of course, then they had a feed lot that has 200,000 cows. So it's an interesting, you can see that the fossil fuels can intermingle very readily with renewable fuels like landfill gas and manure, methane, and so forth.
Sure. And when you have local companies that are innovative, like we talked about a little earlier, Begno Manufacturing, Streamline Energy, these companies that know how to make tools for the oil and gas industry to morph into renewables is not that hard. In fact, they're probably doing some of it right now, and I don't even know about it. But we have to be careful to protect our manufacturing base here that support the oil and gas business, and the service companies that support the oil and gas business. They can change into other operations, but if they go out of business in the middle of the night, they can't do it. They need time to morph and change and educate their workforce to do it. They're certainly willing. If they can make money doing it and do it responsibly, I feel confident that they'll pursue it.
Look at the boat building industry, you know, Metal Shark, for instance,
Sure.
very much started with little
It's
crew boats
amazing.
and all, and then now they're building ferries for New York, and they're building patrol boats for Vietnam and the Philippines, and you know, it's amazing. And
Right.
they had their roots in supporting oil industry at first.
Sure.
They were building these little seismic barges and all of that, and crew boats, you know. But that's amazing. And the crew boat story, you know, that's an amazing success story in supporting oil industry and other activities around the world. But it started with its roots in the oil business.
You mentioned earlier, so I was formerly chairman of the Independent Petroleum Association of America. And one thing that people don't understand is that most of the oil and gas wells drilled in the United States now are still drilled by independent oil companies, not the majors, not the super majors. Roughly 90% of all the oil wells and about 85% of natural gas wells are still drilled by independent oil companies. They're the ones that push the technology. We were talking earlier about moving offshore. Kerr-McGee worked on that and drilled the first offshore well at Morgan City. Well, that created a
Block
whole...
28, I was fishing for
You-
trout there the other
Oh,
day.
yeah.
I know all about it.
Any luck on the trout?
Yeah, we caught trout. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So those are the companies that they push forward with their own small R&D departments, certainly the
What-
majors.
Look at the horizontal drilling in the shale plays, and we talked about Harold Hamm and, you know, Continental Resources, a little company. You know, he was one of the leaders in pioneering this whole process of,
Absolutely.
and it was so innovative to go to one spot and drill 15, 20 wells from one little site
Sure.
instead of poking these things. And it was being cost effective and having minimal environmental impact. But and where they were doing the drilling became the production site too.
Right.
So it's all about lowering the cost,
Footprint.
lowering the footprint, having, less impact on a lot of neighbors. And I think that's was so innovative. And those guys kind of, I guess Chesapeake was part of it in Louisiana, Chesapeake Energy.
Right.
And
EOG and others.
yeah, they pioneered this whole new process that changed the world of energy. I mean, it had enormous impact on the Saudis and the Russians, and you name it. When all of a sudden the U.S. could produce more oil than it needed, and we could actually export oil.
As our friend Paul Hilliard says, we were so good at what we did that we produce more oil than we can sell right now. We're very good at what we do. And I'd like to acknowledge Paul. Paul and I are the only two people in Louisiana to serve as chairman of the Independent Petroleum Association. So thank you, Paul, for everything you've done for us in our business. And I know you.
And I know him real well. I
Yeah.
consider him a friend, taking him fishing, hunting. You might share with us that organization, the Independent Petroleum Producers. How often they meet, and with some of the principles in it, and what are some of their goals?
Sure.
How they responding to this downturn, in the oil business,
And we, through IPAA, we like to call it market contraction, which is an interesting term. It just means a shrinkage in the business because of the price of oil. But IPAA is primarily a lobbying organization for independent oil companies. Having said that, Exxon, Chevron, Mark Miller's little tiny company, and others are all a part of IPAA. So we coalesce to try to put forth the best strategy we can to protect the oil and gas business as we know it. It's still primarily independent oil companies, some of which are no more than 3 people, some are probably 30, the average would be 50. These are privately owned companies, not publicly owned companies. Primarily, there are publicly owned companies, and we're pleased to have them. But we're all trying to figure this out. We're trying to figure out a way to help each other. And what that means is if I operate in a particular area in Louisiana and a company who's based out of Canada operates in that area, maybe there's a way to coalesce our abilities to work together, help them out reducing their production costs and their lease overhead, and thereby making money for both parties. It is a competitive business. It always has been, and the competition is good. But back in the day, in the oil center right here, Mr. Hyman's Oil Center, if you worked for Gulf and you were out competing against a Texaco landman buying leases throughout the day, you both show up on the landowner's doorstep at the same time, which of course they love that, because here's competition knocking on the door. But you know what? And then you're fighting, not physically fighting, you're negotiating, fighting. And then later on that night, you may stop by Chez Pasteur and have a beer together. So, a lot of that camaraderie has passed, but it's still the availability to help each other out, whether it's independent landmen or independent producers. There's a way that we could all lend a shoulder to each other, especially in these hard times, to try to make it through the next few years. It's going to be tough. I mentioned earlier a prediction that IPAA made, which I believe is probably correct, my friend Bob Fricklin. If you're in the bottom 5% of your market share, there's a real possibility that you're going to be approached to be bought out by one of the bigger companies in the service industry. So you're either going to have to reach out across the aisle, if you will, to your competitor and say, okay, we need to get together because we've got such a small market share. The market has disappeared temporarily. How are we going to survive? Or you may have to approach a bigger company and say, we'd like to bring our talent and ability into your organization.
Yeah, you know, there's several things happening in our own legislature. I wonder if your national organization has lobbying efforts down to state level, like Louisiana, does it?
Right. Well, the IPAA, for example, only concentrates and puts money in federal races where
Okay.
we believe it's important. However, we work hand in hand with the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association, Texas Independent Petroleum Association. We're all in this together, but
You'll get along with Congressman Higgins?
yes, we do. We do. We do. But we're all in Washington. Or IPA is based in Washington, and they do a stellar job with a relatively small staff compared to the American Petroleum Institute, which is much larger. But we are there to promote good oil and gas concepts. And when I say good oil and gas concepts, I mean environmentally responsible. I mean recognizing that when we go into a wildlife refuge, we need to know that they're endangered species. We try to share as much information as we can to do our jobs responsibly, so you can drive to work each day or go to school each day and take your kids and drop them off.
There are a couple of bills in the Louisiana legislature. One will try to deny the parish's rights to sue oil and gas companies, mainly dealing with coastal zone permits, the state coastal zone permit program. I
Right.
think that's the basis of the litigation, you know. That's a dual program with the Corps of Engineers. The state literally has no enforcement authority. The Corps does, which they do not exercise at all. You know, the Corps doesn't have a boat, so they can't go out and check and see if that canal that's supposed to be dredged 8 foot deep and 100 feet wide is actually that, and the spoil is supposed to not be more than 3 feet above grade, and that's the case. So, I mean, nobody expects that. But, you know, it's kind of curious that the state would be pushing the parishes to get into this fracas, legal fracas, and comes down to the levy board. I look at what the levy board did a couple of years ago, and they were suing over 100 oil companies.
Sure.
You might have been included in
Sure.
it. And one for damages that they're trying to claim that occurred 30 years before they existed.
That were properly permitted.
They were claiming damages that were flooded caused by levees built by by pipeline or location canals. Well, the levee board is responsible for flooding inside the levee, not outside the levee.
Right.
So they had no issue there. I read the pleading of that case, and the guy, one of the ringleaders, he's an author, was pushing that litigation, and I said, "Y'all don't have standing." I
Right.
said, "You guys, you gotta have economic harm to claim economic damage,
Indeed.
and you have no harm.
Right.
What do you mean? What do you mean no harm?" I said, "It's not costing you a nickel. It might cost a landowner a nickel. It might cost a commercial fisherman a problem, but they're not plaintiffs. You're plaintiffs."
Right.
I said, your case won't stand up in court. We have the best law firm in the state of Louisiana. I don't care where you have the best law firm, you still don't have standing. I don't understand what that means. The judge will explain it to you real quick when he gets there. Well, the case didn't last an hour in court. And the levy board has signed a legal commitment to pay, win or lose. So they're stuck with over $10 million in legal fees.
Regardless.
The smart ones were the lawyers who put this all together. They couldn't lose. And the ones that weren't too bright was the labor board people who inked it, who agreed to this. This was real nonsense. And our legislature spent the whole session trying to fight that thing that I think 2/3 of the guys in the legislature are lawyers. And any of them read the pleadings. They said, "Wait a minute, that levy board doesn't have any real losses here."
Well, and
So I think the parish is in the same legal boat,
Sure. And the cumulative effect is that for the past several years, even though oil and gas companies love to do business in Louisiana, they love our food, they love our people, they love our supply chain, our infrastructure, but those type events have scared
The
many
real
of them away.
negative
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
They've scared them away to the point where if I beg them, they won't come.
Yep. Yeah.
And I know people think, oh, that's just bluster, but I'm telling you, I see the effect. I see the effect on our day-to-day business. And
Well, and one of the things is, look, our landowners are somewhat greedy. They want bigger share than landowners in Texas. We have this severance, it's 12.5%
Sure.
severance on oil, which is astronomical. That's the
highest in
country.
the country. Yeah.
And so the bottom line is, you got a landowner who wants a third royalty, the state wants 12.5% severance. Hell, that's close to 50% just out the door.
Yeah. Not
And you
much
go to
left.
Texas, and they got a 3% severance. And,
Right. It's-
but there's an attempt to do away with the severance, I guess, for
It's a-
18 months or something like
It's
that.
a phase out over time. It's one of the proposals, and I got to go testify in front of the Senate and the House on the veracity of why that's so important, why we need those things. Look, we in the oil and gas business isn't asking for a handout. We're asking for an ability to fight and achieve sustainability and survive in this market. This is not something we feel is an award back to us. We want to stay in business because we believe generating that income is good for the state. The state lease sales used to be millions and millions of dollars every single month that would come into the state, and a lot of it's speculative money. Many of these leases never got drilled on, but the state got to collect the money. In the past 2 years, the revenue has dropped to paltry sums of almost insignificant value. So if you look at what we've generated for the state and made our lives easier for the people that you and I know, and Harold, the thing, you say, well, Lafayette's really more of a medical community now. Well, how many people are going to go have a surgery if they don't have any money
Yeah,
coming
but
in?
people don't understand that the doctors and the used car salesmen and car dealers, they're not the foundation of the economy. It's the rice farmer who puts rice into the market that creates value, that the crawfisherman, the oil man, the guy that pulls salt out of the ground, they're
Right.
the foundation of the economy,
That's
not
right.
the hospitals and all that. So, if Chamber of Commerce wants to improve the economy, they need to look at those foundation economic activities, fishery, shrimping, They say, well, we're bringing $1 million worth of crawfish into St. Martin Parish a week. That doesn't sound like a lot. But that's created value that multiplies 15 times.
Sure.
It's not like the hospital selling $1 million worth. It doesn't multiply at all. And so that's the real importance of the economic impact. Oil and gas and salt and timber and sugarcane.
Right.
Those
They're
are
all connected.
they're all connected. You're
Absolutely.
producing, 100 acres of cane field out there, if you don't produce cane on it, will not impact the economy. When you put 100 acres of cane out and you produce another 7,000 pounds of sugar per acre, and it's 21 pounds, start doing the math.
Right.
And then that multiplies the economy, and Louisiana has 1 million acres of cane. Wow.
That's significant.
What an enormous impact, because that multiplies, not the doctors or the used car salesman or the lawyers. They don't create value. But
Absolutely.
the oil man does, and so does the guy bringing the salt and, harvesting rice or crawfish or you name it. So that's so important that, and you look at Louisiana water bottom, that's a 22% royalty.
Mhm.
And federal waters is 18%.
Right, and going down in some
yeah.
spots.
Yeah, and the federal royalty is going down.
Right.
And so you got the guy can go in state waters 3 miles out, or he can go another quarter of a mile in federal water. The royalty is 4% difference, and the federals don't have a severance. Now you're talking about 16% difference. Why the hell would you put anything in Louisiana water
That's exactly
if you're on the
right.
boundary? And somebody has to deal with these economics and say, why is it so much more profitable to drill a well in Texas? Wow,
Right,
that's one of the reasons. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And so Lafayette has been such an important port of, I guess, the offshore industry. And I guess the big game change in offshore was the BP spill.
Right.
And that changed the world,
It
you know,
did.
and
Choked the business much like the pandemic is doing in some respects.
yeah, it took the offshore business and really whacked it, you know.
Very few players offshore, especially deep water these days. Insurance requirements jumped up after Macondo, and some of those things, rightly so. Some of those things changed for the better. I recognize it, but it took it out of the. It increased the prices so much that some of the responsible players just couldn't do it any longer because they couldn't have the money to protect themselves insurance-wise.
Yeah. Now, Hillcorp, I guess it initiated in Iberia, Hildebrand.
Yeah, right down between
Yeah,
Liberia and
and-
Jeanerette, that little office. Yeah,
And they
Used to be
just
Diamond Chandler.
bought, I think for $4 billion, all of Shell's activities in Alaska.
Right.
That's an amazing, not all the oil companies are suffering here.
No, Jeff Hildebrand's a smart cookie. He incentivizes his personnel very highly. They work very, very hard, but they get paid.
Yeah, my
very
numbers
little.
right, was it 4 billion or 8 billion they paid for Shell's resources? I
I
think it
don't
was
know.
4 billion
Yeah, it sounds
for
like-
Shell's resources.
Yeah.
All of their holdings in Alaska.
Yeah.
And that's just an amazing success story for, you know, and they're going through a hard time, but that will pass.
Sure.
Yeah, because Shell production in Alaska is phenomenal.
And Alaska is a great example of what we could do in certain respects. Alaska is still the biggest, wildest thing in the United States of America and parts of the world. And they love their land. They love their land. They protect it
sure.
for the Native Americans up there. Louisiana has some ways that we could follow step and still promote oil and gas and incentivize economically through the lowering of severance tax, but get more activity, which is good for the workforce. It's good for the local economy.
What do you, yeah, absolutely. The oil industry has taken a lot of blame for the loss of the coastal marshes, you know, which I'm in total disagreement with. You know, I just astounded at the coastal restoration program, how their projects are causing a lot more losses than they're fixing. And I'll cite one example. South of Intercoastal City in Vermilion Parish Freshwater Bay, there's about a 5,000 acre marsh area that was principally drained by an old bayou that used to drain into the bay. And it was cut off by a freshwater bayou. But it was still open in the freshwater bayou, and it allowed this 5,000 acres of marsh, which I grew up on. I lived on and hunted and fished over it, knew it like the back of my hand, hunted deer over it, you know. And this bayou on the west side of freshwater bayou was always full of mullet and shrimp, and I would catch my bait there for my catfish lines.
Nice.
So here comes the Coastal Restoration Project. They're going to rock it. They're going to rock the whole area, you know. And so I called the folks involved. I said, "I shouldn't close that bayou because it's the tidal drain for about 5,000 acres. Oh, it'll drain other places." I said, "It's also the inflow area from the bay where the shrimp come into that marsh. The shrimp and juvenile trout and juvenile redfish and the sediment that's nourishing it all comes in through that one." And I would use a little pull net through there so I could see the shrimp that went. I could see
Right.
the juvenile trout. I could see, because, you know, during the spring I was there catching my bait there all the time. So I even called the principals with Vermilion Corporation and said, "You don't need to close that pipe." "Oh, well, no, we've managed the marsh successfully for 100 years. We know what to do." "Okay, all right." So 3 years ago, they closed it. I was in there a couple of weeks ago. There's, of that 5,000 acres, 2,000 acres have opened up into a big lake in 3 years.
So you've lost it.
So you've lost it. You have lost it. It's phenomenal. you look at the projects at Pecan Island, and I was crabbing there yesterday. With a
Any
20,
luck, by the way?
yeah, we
Oh,
caught a
good.
bunch of crabs.
Good.
So we, in a 20-foot boat with a 225 mercury on it, and this is where 30 years ago cattle grazed. Now the water's 5 feet deep, the bottom is solid as this floor, you know, and I asked the guy who lives at island, what caused it? Oh, he says these farmers, you know, these ranchers here, they could have the levees built free by the parish. So they built levees way out into the marsh to get more pasture. And then they pumped it off. And he says, this is just muck, you know, this is just marsh mud. And as long as it had water, it was fine. But you took the water of it, it just sunk like a rock.
How about
And the levees was sitting on this marsh mud too. So
they've all,
it all went down. You said in 3 or 4 years, these pastures where cattle were grazing, it's all turned to marsh. Had nothing to do with oil companies. It has to do with stupidity, you know. And we've done this over and over again. It's phenomenal. We spent $38 million of Vermilion Parish in closing a 5,000 acre marsh system. We built 11 dams. They have 22 pipes in the 11 dams. They're 2-foot pipes that have flap gates, and the water can only go out. So nothing come in. The sediment can't come in. The shrimp can't come in. You know, I mean, you end up with just a colossal disaster. You know, the marsh stays flooded, and you lose all the vegetation. There's no sediment come in, and so a bad situation can be. But we spent $38 million, and the actual recovery was 310 acres. So we spent 125,000 acres trying to save marsh, and it's not going to save it. It's what they've done is going to make it worse.
right.
And you know, somewhere in this picture you want to blame, you know, the pipelines, the oil industry, and they've had some impact, you know, but I
Sure.
can see the restoration program is causing a lot more damage. And we mentioned the area at Marsh Island. They were trying to recover 350 acres, and they dredged these humongous holes in the bay. Well, the bottom of the bay is just as valuable habitat as the marsh. So you can't go drill holes out there. There's no notification to shrimpers. The shrimpers crawl in the area. They're in 5 feet of water. They get to a spot where the water drops 30 feet, and then that drops into it, and it's not coming out the other side. And you know, so they lose their gear. There's no notice to mariners, and the shrimpers are screaming, raising hell about it, but they fall on deaf ears. You know, the dredging companies love it, the politicians love it, the landowners love it. The federal agencies that each one of these projects has to have a federal sponsor.
Right.
They're all for it because they're getting funded with it.
Sure.
And one of these projects that I was involved in was a place, the Jaws, that's filled in. It allows the flood water of all of the Test Vermilion system to get into the bay. Well, it's all filled in. So anyway, it's a small project, $2 million project, maybe. And so but no one's sponsoring it. After a year, they decided they're not getting the support of it, so they withdrew their support for it, you know. So, but in that process, I asked them, and when you are supporting a project, do you do a fisheries study before? Do you do an analysis of the botanical regime? What are the plants like? What's the sediment regime? What's the availability of sediment? What's the water flows? What is the current fisheries of surviving and living in it? You know? So you have a baseline to measure success or failure. No, we don't do that. That's too expensive. Now wait a minute. You spent $150,000 an acre to recover a marsh, and you
That's
worried
too
about
expensive.
it's too expensive?
What
Really?
happened to common sense?
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yes. So I have a real problem with the coastal restoration program, and I have a real problem with, you know, laying blame on, you know, activities that had a very small part in it, you know. The program itself is causing a lot of the loss.
Problems.
Well, the biggest was a 6,000 acre project sponsored by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, 39 million project. It was planned and engineered by the office here in Lafayette in Cameron Parish. And it built a levee around 6,000 acres of marsh that tied into Calcasieu Lake, the Mud Lake they call it, down in Lower Cameron Parish, where the Calcasieu River went across it. They had 4 major buyers come into it. That lake produced 3 or 4 million pounds of shrimp a year. And when they did this project, the shrimp production went from 3 million pounds a year to less than 20,000 pounds. The 4 buyers that were the principal shrimp production area, they built dams and weirs, but there's no operation plan, so it all stayed closed. So it flooded the marsh. In 2 years, the 6,000 acres was 3 or 4 feet of water. So the whole project was a complete disaster.
And Harold, let me ask you a question. Is that a case of cross-agency non-communication?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
that's what it
Yeah.
sounds like.
Because you see, National Marine Fisheries is saying you can't close any bayou.
Right.
And to close a bayou, this is all done in coastal restoration project. We dammed the bayou. That's to stop salt water from coming in,
Right.
theoretically. And of course, whether you dam a river in Montana or bayou in Louisiana, the result is the same. The bayou river becomes a lake. Now in Montana, the rocks and that lake will be there 1 million years from now. But in Louisiana, when you turn the marsh into a lake, it's going to disappear in a few years. In a few years, when it stays flooded, you lose 99% of the vegetation. There's no settlement inflow. You lose all the fisheries, so the whole thing falls apart. And we are paying to do this over and over again. We're spending millions doing this, and it's colossal, the disaster. And much of the marshland loss we're dealing with today was a result of coastal restoration projects since the middle 80s. You want to cry when you see the losses that have
I know
occurred.
your friend Mr. Scarrett and Ed Kyle would both agree with you.
Oh, yeah.
Over the
Oh,
years,
yeah.
they would
Oh, yeah.
definitely
Oh, yeah.
agree with what you're saying. So.
And the Chapala Basin is a disaster in a lot of places, and like the marshland, if you restore a bayou's tidal exchange, the recovery is rather swift. If shrimp can access the marsh, juvenile trout can go in the marsh. The decaying vegetation is what feeds clams and oysters, and it's a whole ecosystem. When you put that dam, you stop everything. You stop the inflow of sediment, you stop the fisheries totally, 100%.
Right.
And we're spending billions doing this. The project in Vermilion Parish was $38 million to recover 305 acres. And I was there with Congressman Higgins. We standing on a concrete dam that's about a quarter of a mile long. He said, "Isn't this a wonderful project?" I said, "Congressman, this is a real piece of crap, I said, "You standing on a dam. You think a shrimp can jump this dam? You think a juvenile trout who has to come into this marsh to survive cannot survive in the open bay or the open Gulf? Can it jump this concrete dam? Well, no. You think the sediment, the muddy water, look at the muddy water in freshwater bayou, and look at the clear water in the marsh. You think they're connected? The mud should be restoring the sediment. And I said, hey, you can't build concrete dam and say you're fixing the marsh. You're destroying it.
Not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. So it's appalling that, and it's a shame to say that most of the funding came from the BP. I mean, that program is getting $900 million a year for 10 years from the BP settlement, and that's their major source of funding.
Sure.
They are getting funding now from offshore royalties, but offshore royalties is going down tremendously. So we're getting close to the end of the program. I want to thank you so much, Mark, for being here. I note a tone of optimism about the oil business recover, certainly for the nation, hopefully for Louisiana. And my son has a project in Louisiana coming up, so that's a good sign.
thing. That's
Yeah,
a very
you and the land business, you're the first guys to know something positive is happening.
We're the leading economic indicator.
Right,
Absolutely.
yeah, like the architect. When the architect gets a project, you know it's gonna happen,
Right.
So
Well,
thank you, Mark, for
Thank you
being
for
here.
having me, Harold.
And I
really-
appreciate your membership in the Sierra Club. That's
Yes,
great,
sir.
sir. Yes, sir.
I'm not
Thank you.
afraid to admit I'm a member of the Sierra Club. I'm an old man, but I still love the environment.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yes.
There can be a balance.
There is, and there has to be.
Yeah.
So thank you for being on the program.
Absolutely.
All right. We're
All
done.
right. Well, not many
Thank you.
calls, but that's okay.
Well,
I enjoyed it.
Jamberger called.
Yeah.
Of course, he's got a business that he's working on,
Oh, I think, I don't
Yeah.
know him, so.
Yeah, so, but anyway, I think, we're going through a cycle. Lafayette is going through the cycle before